Will Donald Trump be the last pro-Israel president of the United States? How dangerous is the surge in anti-Semitism? What should we think about Zohran Mamdani, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and what's been happening at the Heritage Foundation? Are all this the harbingers of the end of American Jewish life? And are Jews or Israelis making it easier for the Jew haters? Those are just some of the questions you want answered. Next on Think Twice, it's time for the viewers to ask me just about anything, and for me to give you at least some of the answers. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Welcome to our annual year-end Ask Me Anything episode. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now, to today's program. Before I start answering all the questions, I want to thank everyone who wrote in and to the great many of you who said many nice things about our program and JNS in general. We're very grateful for your reading, listening, and viewing JNS, as well as those who contribute financial support. We couldn't do it without you. So let me start by noting that I received a lot of questions from viewers about our recent episodes with the Heritage Foundation's Victoria Coates and commentator Josh Hammer, which both centered on reactions to Tucker Carlson's anti-Semitism and the fallout from that. A number of viewers wrote in to question whether Jews are too addicted to institutions like Heritage to think clearly about what seemed like Heritage's betrayal on Carlson and its president Kevin Roberts' initial defense of him, and then subsequent backtracking. One reader with the handle of @Jody6851 said, "I'm not buying Victoria Coates' rationalizations for what happened at Heritage. Why should anyone else?" Others wondered if Ben Shapiro was right to fight against anti-Semitism inside the conservative movement if it was a lost cause. Some took the opposite position, asking whether critics of Tucker and Megyn Kelly are creating more anti-Semites. We also received a very thoughtful response from Steve Bloomer in Calgary, Canada, who asked whether we are being too hard on Megyn Kelly. Is she just trying to be fair and to be loyal to a friend, whether that's the friend of Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens? Well, here's my response. I think I need to preface any comments about what happened in the last 2 months in the fallout from which began with Tucker Carlson's hosting Nick Fuentes, the head of the Groypers, a neo-Nazi, lunatic anti-Semite, on his program, and the fact that, much like previous, efforts by Carlson to platform anti-Semitism, notably a year earlier when he had on Holocaust denier Darryl Cooper, whom he proclaimed as the best, contemporary historian, but a person who wasn't actually a historian. But I don't think I've ever been quite as shocked about any development in the news as I was about what happened at Heritage. Now, that sounds a little off, because a lot worse things in the world have happened. October 7th, wars, all kinds of, other horrible, horrible things, 9/11. But I was really shocked by what happened at Heritage because it wasn't what I was expecting. As a journalist, as a career journalist, I'm sort of something of a wise Alec by both predilection and personality and by profession. I've seen a lot of what's going on in the last few decades, and even when terrible things happen, it's often just reinforcing my sense of, well, this is the world I always thought I was living in. I did not think I was living in a world where the head of Heritage, a institution, a think tank in Washington that has been at the cutting edge of fighting anti-Semitism and helping to inspire the Trump administration's efforts to combat anti-Semitism, for it to embrace Tucker Carlson the way that Kevin Roberts did, that was really, really shocking to me. When it happened, I reached out to at least a couple of friends and said, am I crazy? So this was it was a deeply unsettling development, and everything that follows from that, I think, revolves around the question of how is it that the Overton window of acceptable discourse has been moved to the point where conservatives, as well as people on the left, are now saying it's okay to be anti-Semitic, and I'm not going to be judgmental about it. I'm going to stand by my friends. Megyn Kelly, someone, not a particularly ideological figure, although, she started out a critic of Trump, and then she's a Trump loyalist. She's kind of been all over the place, but she's kind of a very mainstream journalist kind of person. And, her reaction to this, which clearly seemed to be her sticking her finger up into the wind to see what's fashionable, what will help generate clicks, it's very cynical, was to say that I'm not going to, draw a line in the sand when it comes to anti-Semitism. That's something about which we have to agree to disagree. That was also the message of J.D. Vance at the last week's Turning Point USA America Fest, and that was, if you read my column about it, also deeply shocking and also deeply troubling. There's clearly, we need to understand that there has been a genuine shift on the right. This issue is important because Tucker is important. Backtrack for a moment in that, he doesn't come out of nowhere. He wasn't born on the internet. He is a figure of cable news, someone who's been around for a while and who got his big chance in 2019, I believe, 2018 or 2019, when he was given Bill O'Reilly's longtime spot at 8 o'clock on Fox News. And while there, certainly in his early years and during the Black Lives Matter summer of 2020, he became kind of a tribune of conservatism. That's forgotten a little bit now because he doesn't really talk about issues that most people care about. Now his politics seems to revolve around anybody who will say anything bad about Israel, which is pretty much the definition of anti-Semitism. But then he was, and I say tribune, it's sort of like, from the Roman Republic. He was like tribune of the plebs, speaking out against the abuses of the credentialed elites who formed the Democratic Party and who formed this racialist consensus to impose the woke catechism on America. And he pushed back hard on it, and he became very popular because of that. And that gave him a lot of credibility on the right, along with his ties with people like J.D. Vance, whom he relentlessly promoted during his Senate race in 2022, and reportedly helped gain him the vice presidential nomination in 2024, along with Donald Trump Jr., another friend and business partner of Tucker. So he is a big deal, and the fact that he has embraced anti-Semitism, and that it, as much as it has earned him the opprobrium of people like me and others, it hasn't cost him his legitimacy within the conservative ecosphere. And even his access within the sphere of the Trump family. So that's a very big deal. And neutrality about that, Megyn Kelly's neutrality, is also important. The fact that she, as some of the people who wrote in would say, would blaming Jews and blaming people like Ben Shapiro for caring about anti-Semitism is outrageous. Now, let me just stop, and reinforce a principle here. Anti-Semitism isn't caused by anything the Jews do. Anti-Semites have always hated the Jews for a variety of reasons, because they were poor, because they were rich, because they assimilated, because they didn't assimilate. Anti-Semitism is always about the anti-Semites and the way they use this issue to acquire power. And that leads to another question, which I heard from a number of viewers and posters on our YouTube episodes, why don't I debate anti-Semites? I think some of them who were anti-Semitic were saying, well, if you don't debate us, isn't that proving that you can't defeat us? Your points are invalid. No, that is not the case. I don't debate anti-Semites on this program or elsewhere because I don't think that I should grant legitimacy to people who want to deny rights to Jews, for people who think that the Jews are the only people not entitled to a homeland, who think that Israel should be judged in a way that no other nation should be judged, the way that Jews should be judged, as no other people should be judged. It's just prejudice. I think we should treat prejudice against Jews the way our society treats prejudice against racial minorities like African Americans or Hispanics. It should be beyond the pale. If you platform and embrace ideas, as Tucker Carlson increasingly has, it's not just platforming anymore, and you are an anti-Semite, I don't think that grants you a hearing. Now, I'm not saying he doesn't have a right to have a show. I'm not about canceling and wiping him off the internet. I'm opposed to efforts that have been embraced by a lot of liberal Jewish groups, frankly, the Anti-Defamation League, in favor of censorship on the internet. I'm not in favor of censorship. What I am saying is that mainstream discourse should draw lines. He can exist in his own program. The Tucker Carlson network can be there, and those who want to watch it can watch it. But I don't think mainstream politicians should treat him as a legitimate figure as long as he is an anti-Semite, which obviously it doesn't look like he's going back on that. And that's what's so troubling. And that's why the question of Megyn Kelly's neutrality about anti-Semitism is not as important as J.D. Vance's neutrality. The question is what to do about it. Now, Heritage, and some of the viewers who wrote in, and some of these questions were like, do you write off Heritage? Why did we have Victoria Coates, who's a Heritage VP, who's heading its efforts to fight anti-Semitism and its pro-Israel work? Shouldn't we just cut them off because of what Kevin Roberts said? And even though he walked it back, they never took down that initial video. And, there were real questions about why they were in business with Tucker Carlson, basically, and whether, non-disparagement clauses, played into his willingness to stand up for Tucker, along with the friendship. Heritage is still doing important work. I understand why people don't want to work with it anymore. I understand why many serious scholars have left it, and donors and members. I chose to have her on because, number one, we needed to pose those questions about it. And, Victoria did her best to answer it. If you didn't like those answers, that's a valid response. But she's trying to fight from within, I would say, to keep it on point and keep it away from the influence of Tucker Carlson. It's not clear to me whether she's going to win in the end. I hope she does. But that's where we are. Now, the question is, whether Heritage is a lost cause, whether that's true of J.D. Vance as well. That remains to be seen. What do we do about it? Well, we speak up. We fight. The same as we do with left-wing anti-Semitism. Silence is how the haters win, is how the anti-Semites win. They're seeking their goal, whether it's on campuses or at, Turning Point USA conventions where people like Tucker Carlson and unfortunately the vice president speak to say, don't bring this up, don't fight about this. This is where we must fight about it. Their goal is to silence us, to intimidate us. And we're not going to be, certainly not on this program, not on JNS. But it's up to the American people to render a verdict about that. What that verdict will be, history and time will tell. But that's where we need to be on this issue. Now, a related question was one that was summed up by a viewer with the handle of Yiftach Paltrowitz 6559. who wrote in to say that, quote, there is no way in hell, he didn't actually write out hell, a religious person, obviously, that I will vote for J.D. Vance if he's the Republican candidate in 2028. No way. It's clear that he's a closet graper who can't bring himself to draw moral distinctions or recognize anti-Semitism. Now, I'll address this by starting to say I'm not going to tell that reader or listener, viewer, or any of you how to vote. I'm not, as I often say, when I go around and give speeches and I'm asked questions about partisan politics, I'm not going to tell you how to vote. And it's not just because JNS is a nonprofit. It's because I'm not in the parties and politicians business. JNS is not in the parties and politicians business. We are in the Jewish ideas business, and we speak up for those ideas and principles. And when people do the right thing and just, echo the principles that we think are right, we're going to speak up in support of what they're doing. And when they do the opposite, we're going to note it and criticize them. That's how it goes. It's not about partisanship. Now, Vance is Vice President J.D. Vance is a pivotal figure in the struggle over anti-Semitism in the U.S.-Israel relationship. And it's not just because he is a vice president. He is a deeply intellectual person. He's that rare politician. I'd say Ted Cruz, who may be his rival in 2028, is another who is truly an intellectual. He's someone that can articulate a lot of the ideas that Trump is talking about in a way that is more serious. He's given a lot of thoughts. He's changed his mind about a lot of issues, including Trump. But he is way ahead. And for that and for other reasons, way ahead in the race for 2028 to succeed Trump. Now, the 2028 race, which will be in, full flower 2 years from now, God willing, if we're sitting here doing another Ask Me Anything episode in December 2027, we'll probably be talking about J.D. Vance, but it's also light years. It's forever. It's lifetimes away in politics. So we don't know what's going to happen. And the truth is, as much as Vance's professed neutrality about Carlson's anti-Semitism and that of the Groypers themselves, is deeply troubling. It's not like he hasn't changed his mind before. And it's not like he's wrong about every issue. He's very right, I believe, to be against censorship in Europe. I wrote to commend the speech he gave back in February, criticizing members of the European Union that were trying to silence people who were speaking up against open immigration, open borders policies in Europe that was changing the nature of a number of these nations. But the idea that the GOP can be a big tent that includes both people who care about anti-Semitism, so the Republican Jewish Coalition, the RJC, and the Groypers, is morally indefensible as well as politically impossible. That is not something. Now, will he pay a political price for this neutrality about Carlson? Again, we'll find out. I suspect that is not a winning formula, and I've written as much. That is not a winning formula for any presidential candidate. But right now, he's way ahead for the Republican nomination. Ted Cruz is the only figure of note who seems to be willing to challenge him. The person I think a lot of people would like to challenge him, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, has made it clear he's not going to run against J.D. Vance. I think that's probably wise because, as much as I think Rubio is pretty great in many ways, and certainly great on the issues that we at JNS care about, he didn't do so well the first time he ran for president in 2016. Running for president is not like running for any other office, no matter how successful you are on a local or state level, whether it's for governors or senators. Fellow Floridian Ron DeSantis found that out. He wasn't ready for prime time in 2016. It's not clear that he'll be ready for it in the future. And, he's, challenging Vance from within the administration is probably not going to work. So that will remain to be seen. I think American elections are won in the center. Recent elections have been kind of base elections. Both parties work on getting their bases out. But I think those who think that's how Donald Trump won in 2024 are slightly mistaken. Now, it's true. His base did come out, and the Democrats' base, perhaps didn't as well, with the same enthusiasm, which was understandable because, Kamala Harris wasn't a candidate that many people could be very enthusiastic about for a number of very good reasons. However, Trump stands on a lot of key social issues, whether it's, as well as immigration, the trans madness, that resonated with the broad center of American politics. Sure, we may be a bifurcated nation, half the nation, half of Americans like Trump, half hate him. But the issues that won him that election were centrist issues. Those were issues that, it's sort of like some of the things that, the left takes issue with Trump, whether it's, attacking drug cartel boats or closing the borders against illegal immigrants. It seems like, they're taking, a side in an issue which is 80-20, and they're taking the side that 20% have not, Trump's on the 80% side. I happen to think, as much as anti-Semitism has, the Overton window has moved on it, but I still think anti-Semitism is an 80-20 issue in which most Americans are not on the side of the anti-Semites. Tucker Carlson may get a lot of cheers at Turning Point USA conventions. He may get cheered at a Republican convention again, as he was, last year. But he's not someone that can help you win an election. And Democrats, unless they nominate someone who is just as anti-Semitic as Tucker Carlson, which they may well do, if they are able to nominate a centrist candidate, or at least one that can pretend to be a centrist, like Gavin Newsom or maybe even Josh Shapiro, although I wouldn't bet on Shapiro's chances, they will tie Carlson around J.D. Vance's neck, and that's not going to be a winning issue for him. Now, next, we also received a lot of responses and questions about Zohran Mamdani, what to expect from him as he takes over New York City this week. He's be sworn in on New Year's Day. Mamdani's anti-Zionism and anti-Semitic record, let's state up front, is not a sidebar to his career or to his election. It's one of his core principles. Now, how should we react to it? Which is, sums up, about a dozen or 24 questions that I received in the last week. Well, it's not 1933. New York City after New Year's Day will not be like Berlin in 1933. They're not going to be rounding up Jews. It's not the same thing. But complacency or rationalization of his stance is not acceptable. And in this regard, reader Lucy Ramsey wrote in to ask what will happen if Jews don't stand up in their thousands against the surge of anti-Semitism. How can we prevent another catastrophe? Now, I think we need to define what we mean by catastrophe. This isn't the harbinger to an American Holocaust. New York City, as I just said, won't be a no-go zone for Jews. Too many Jews are already there. Some of, there's whether it's 30% or what it was, they voted for Mamdani. I think many of them did so because they'll just vote for whoever the Democratic candidate is. That's true in New York. It's true in most parts of the country. In the South, they always spoke of red dog, Democrats, because people would vote for a Democrat even if he was a red dog. Well, I think there are a lot of Jews in New York who fit into that too. Some are in New York, whether they're sort of members, citizens of the People's Republic of the Upper West Side. Some of them are anti-Zionists. Some of them are on the far left. There's no question about that. But I think we shouldn't be distracted by the fact that some Jews voted for him. The overwhelming majority of Jews did not, even though the overwhelming majority of Jews in this country, and especially in New York City, are Democrats. History neither rhymes nor repeats itself. But what we are witnessing is a historic shift against Jews and normalizing anti-Semitism in a way that is unprecedented in modern American history. And that's the point we need to be emphasizing. I think our reaction to it is that Jews must start protesting. There was when President Trump was first elected, Democrats, for the most part, reacted by not being a loyal opposition. but by being a resistance. And that took took form in many different ways, some of which was entirely legitimate, whether it was protest, some of it not so legitimate, such as promoting the Russian collusion hoax and, fake, impeachment on, his call with the president of Ukraine. Some of this is, turned into lawfare. But I'm not for lawfare against anybody, even Zoran Mamdani. But what isn't legitimate is treating someone who is an open anti-Semite as just another politician. Now, Jewish leaders may feel they have to work with whoever is running the government for administrative or security reasons, and I get that. But I think it is very important for Jews to be willing to turn out and fight against Mamdani, resist any normalization of his anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as he puts that into effect. I think having a socialist being, he's not the first far left person to be mayor of New York. Bill de Blasio, who was mayor from 2013 to 2021, was, pretty far left himself. But I think Mamdani takes it to another level. I think his policies will be disastrous for all New Yorkers. Socialism, communism doesn't work, never has, won't work now. But to the extent that this legitimizes policies that creates not merely a hostile environment, as we'd say in the human, in the sort of human relations way, but rather puts it into action, whether it's BDS, which he's clearly supportive of, discriminatory policies against Israelis and Israeli businesses or institutions that are connected to Israel. The Jews have to turn out. They have to go into the streets. They can't normalize it. They can't treat this as just an agreement, something where we have to agree to disagree. As I said, when it comes just as with debating anti-Semites, you can't legitimize it. It doesn't work. And if you do, it just makes them stronger. It doesn't, you're not going to argue them out of it. What you're going to do is, strengthen them. And I think that is the proper response. As issues come up, we'll see how that works out. But I think that's the important principle. And I would certainly urge mainstream Jewish leaders, the mainstream organizations that have largely failed the community in recent years as they began to view themselves as basically liberal partisan organizations. ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, was most guilty of this. And they're most guilty because, unlike many Jewish organizations who are basically obsolescent, created to deal with problems of 120 years ago, which no longer exist, ADL still has a job, and it wasn't doing it very well or doing it at all in recent years. I'm slightly encouraged by the way they've reacted to Mamdani, creating a Mamdani watch, for which they have been roundly bashed by their fellow left-wingers and liberals. Let's hope they stick to that. Let's hold them accountable for that. Now, next, and related to this, Missy Rich wrote in to ask about the post-October 7th protests against Israel. She wondered why they were so well organized, and she says it seemed that they knew the plan in advance. And she also asked why the IRS hasn't removed their tax-exempt status for organizations that fund terror groups while pretending to be supporting social justice. And in particular, she's interested in the connection between left-wing liberal and progressive groups and Islamists. Well, my response is to say, clearly they were ready to spring into action. I think there were some questionable, there was an open question about whether they knew in advance because they were just ready to jump right in. I rather doubt, just because I'm a cynical journalist and nobody's presented any convincing proof to the contrary, that anybody, on the Upper West Side of New York or in Chicago or LA was privy to Hamas's battle plans. I don't think it's that simple. I think, however, these are groups that have been preparing and working on promoting anti-Semitism and anti-Israel slanders all along. They reacted the same way after previous fighting in Gaza, after previous terror attacks on Israel. So they were perhaps better prepared now. but they are also very well funded. The most, prominent guilty party there is the left-wing billionaire philanthropist George Soros and his open sources foundations. They poured a lot of money into this, not the only ones. And I think the fact that's their ties with some of these extreme groups, extreme anti-Semitic groups, is not really questionable. I think it bears investigation whether some of these groups do have active ties with terrorist groups and their apologists. The Muslim Brotherhood, is a very amorphous organization, which is why the United States has found it difficult to designate them as a terrorist organization, which hopefully will happen. It's being considered by the Trump administration, even though some of their friends in Qatar are pushing back hard against it. But I think that is a fair point. Now, an even more important point is this whole idea of this red-green alliance of Marxists and Islamists. It's very important, and it doesn't get enough notice. The connection between various, seemingly completely disparate groups, Marxists who are very left-wing and everything, and on social issues, and Islamists, who hate gays, who don't believe in rights for women. How can they make common cause with, how can basically Marxist, left-wingers, trans rights activists make common cause with Islamists? Well, anti-Semitism is the great common denominator, always has been, with disparate groups. And the connection between them, and now, as we've seen in recent months with this whole Tucker Carlson, Groyper, Nick Fuentes business, it's horseshoe politics. The two ends of the political spectrum always have a lot more in common than you would think, certainly more in common with each other than with centrists, with whom they supposedly make common cause. And the cause that they have in common is anti-Semitism. That's more than enough to sustain this relationship. And, we need to call it out. It's what we've been doing. And I think it can't be pointed out enough that, this is morphing. It's moving. It's not just the two ends of the horseshoe. It's veering towards the center. And that's why, go back again, J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson, it's one thing for somebody to have a podcast, with millions of viewers and hits, and Fuentes has millions of followers, whether a lot of them are bots or not. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of eyeballs. But it's another thing for the Vice President of the United States to embrace that, or to be neutral about it. And for that, we saw this on the other side of the spectrum during the Biden administration, where people like Vice President Kamala Harris was guilty of what, to sit here and quote myself, as my daughter likes to say, I do a lot, where when confronted with people, platforming and speaking blood libels against Israel and expressing anti-Semitism and extreme anti-Israel rhetoric that is anti-Semitism, her reaction was what that the left accused President Donald Trump of doing in 2017, in the Charlottesville right-wing riot, where they claim he said that there were very fine people on the side of the neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan there. That's not what he said. He was referring to the debate about whether to take down Confederate statues, but it doesn't matter. People repeat that lie about him all the time. But in point of fact, when Kamala Harris was faced with the issue of what do you think about when someone asked you a question expressing anti-Semitism, her reaction was basically to say, these are very fine people and I'm not going to be judgmental about them. Joe Biden didn't, who always loved to say he was a Zionist, pretty much did the same thing because he was afraid of the political left. Well, now that's what J.D. Vance is doing on the right. And it's no more acceptable when he does it than when Kamala Harris did it. Indeed, Kamala Harris, the two of them might be facing off again in 2028. We'll see. But there should be no tolerance for people who tolerate anti-Semitism. That's the line that we should be drawing in the sand. And it's a line that should not be a line that's just drawn by conservatives, Zionists. It should be drawn by liberals, by everybody. Any decent person should treat this as anathema. And if you don't, well, you're not merely wrong, and you're not merely on the wrong side of history. You're on the wrong side of a deeply moral position that is the most, frankly, among the most important of our, if not the most important of our time. Now, next question. We received a few questions about President Trump. Someone with the handle of Ken Morit 5828 wrote in to ask whether Trump will be the last pro-Israel president, given Vice President J.D. Vance's positions and what's going on the left with the Democrats. Reader Lynn Lecter wrote in to ask, where in heaven's name would we be without Trump? Well, that's a good question. Will he be the last pro-Israel president? That's possible. I think I'm always against catastrophizing, and it's always a mistake to make firm predictions about these sorts of things. It's hard to imagine a pro-Israel candidate, presidential candidate, being nominated by the Democrats. It's certainly possible, and I wouldn't have said so a year or two ago, that the Republicans might nominate someone who is at the very least neutral about Israel, and J.D. Vance seems to be trending in that direction. Now, he wasn't always there. Just last year, he gave a speech to the anti-Israel Quincy Institute in which he lauded Israel as the ideal America First ally for the United States, but he doesn't seem to be saying that anymore. But the truth is, most in the Republican Party and the GOP are still pro-Israel. The polls are what they are. Certainly, support for Israel has taken a hit in the last couple of years due to the deluge of biased coverage of the war in Gaza and the post-October 7th war, and the indoctrination of so many Americans, especially younger Americans, in intersectional settler colonialism, critical race theory, toxic myths, in which Israel and Jews are falsely branded as white oppressors. But yeah, there's still, a strong plurality, if not majority, in this country. After the worst, tsunami of anti-Israel coverage in the media, most Americans are still pro-Israel. More to the point, the vast majority of Republicans are still pro-Israel. The contrast between Republicans and Democrats on this issue is almost absolute. There's nothing they disagree about more other than Trump himself. And let me make one more point, which kind of goes against, conventional wisdom. Don't assume that the Democrats will remain in the hands of the far left forever. If the left loses them consecutive elections, nothing stays the same in American politics. The worm is always turning. Factions rise and they fall. And that can be bad sometimes, and it can sometimes be good. If, as is entirely possible, the Bernie Sanders anti-Israel, anti-Semitic wing, if you will, of the Democratic Party wins the 2028 nomination, whether it's someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, I don't think that's out of the question, or someone appealing to that constituency. The hard left forms the base of the Democratic Party. They were more or less cheated out of the nomination in 2016 and 2020 and 2024. They may not be denied in 2028. And if that leads to a sort of 1972-like George McGovern disaster, when the hard left won over the Democratic Party in 1972, that led to a 49-state landslide for the Republicans. If AOC is leading the Democrats, I wouldn't exactly mortgage the house on her winning a general election, even though I think she could win, the primaries, or someone like her. In the aftermath of that, don't count on the Democratic Party staying in the hands of the left. Parties like to win elections. That's what they exist for. So again, pro-Israel candidates, a more centrist, moderate pro-Israel position may revive in the Democratic Party right now. That seems really unlikely. Somebody like John Fetterman could never hope. I mean, he may be challenged in the, for when he runs for re-election to the Senate in 2028, and who knows how that's going to work out. But in the future, things can change. So don't make hard and fast predictions about, Trump being the last pro-Israel president. He could be, but if the majority of the American people have anything to say about it, he won't be. Now, as far as Trump's position sort of in Jewish history, which is what Lynn Lecter was saying when she asked, where would we be without him? Well, I love counterfactuals, what ifs of history. Had he not been elected in 2016, history is very different. There's no Abraham Accords. There's no, the U.S. Embassy might well still be in Tel Aviv and not in Jerusalem. The Golan Heights would still be considered Syria, according to the United States. That would have had incalculable effects on Hamas's willingness to make war. And quite frankly, if he had won in 2020, that would have changed, which, he did not. That creates a whole different set of counterfactuals, the Hamas war. And in the second term, Iran, the ceasefire hostage deal, what he's done in just this first year in office, attacking Iran, helping Israel destroy Iran's, or destroy, seriously damage Iran's nuclear program, supporting getting all the hostages out, and fighting anti-Semitism on campus with his war on elite institutions that a lot of liberals are very uncomfortable with, even though they should be in favor of it. It reminds us, some basic principles. I always like to quote one of my mentors when I was in college at Columbia University, the late, great Eugene Rice, who was the chairman of the history department back then. He said to me a line that I've never forgotten and quote often, that nothing in history is inevitable. Everything is evitable. Trump's winning in 2016 and again in 2024 changed the world. It changed the Jewish world. With respect to the U.S.-Israel relationship, it's much stronger because of him. Will this last? That's another question. We don't know how that's going to work out. As I said, we don't know who his successor will be. We don't know how the last 3 years of his second term will turn out. Right now, there was, just wrote about it this week, there was a lot of expectation from the left in places like the New York Times and Haaretz that Trump was going to read the riot act to Netanyahu when he met with him in Florida, and that did not happen. In fact, he expressed tremendous support for Israel and Netanyahu. Netanyahu is working very hard to stay in Trump's good graces. He's awarding him the government's giving him the Israel Prize, something that has never been given to a non-Israeli citizen. You can say that's over the top, but it's, quite frankly, obviously a very good investment. So Trump has changed things, and Trump has strengthened Israel. You can, love him, you can hate him, but you can't deny that the U.S.-Israel relationship was fundamentally transformed by him and made much stronger. It's been very shaky under the last two Democratic presidents, under both Obama and Biden, each in their own different ways. And Trump has kind of moved things in a very, very different direction. Had Kamala Harris been elected last year, Iran would be in a much stronger position. So would Hamas. But that's not what happened. These are counterfactuals. They're what-if questions. And we'll see what happens going forward from here. But anybody who thinks that Trump isn't a seminal figure, frankly, in modern Israeli and Jewish history, is wrong. And that's true, as I said, whether you love him or hate him, he changed things enormously. He's been an enormously consequential president for conservatives, especially to those who grew up revering Reagan. In some ways, he's accomplished more for the conservative movement than Reagan ever did. Reagan, put some speed bumps in front of, the liberal train. Trump has tried to turn it around, and in some ways he has. In some ways he's failed. Ultimately he'll be judged by how, as with every president, how the economy does and things like that. But Trump is enormously consequential. Now, a related question came from reader Gary Silo, who asked, do you think by Israel becoming self-sufficient in terms of weapons, will that hurt relations with the United States? Interesting question. Number one, Israel is a long way from being self-sufficient in terms of weapons supplies. Prime Minister Netanyahu, after the experience of the year and a half with Biden during wartime, where the United States was slow-walking arms deliveries, holding back on some, doing everything it could to use its leverage to prevent Israel from achieving a decisive result against Hamas. I think Israelis of all political stripes have sort of seen that and understood that they must produce much more of their own arms, especially ammunition, for carrying on conventional warfare, not just, the fighter jets and, the high-tech weapons, but also, just, artillery shells, right? Ammunition for and supplies for infantry. And I think Israel is making steps towards that, but it's not there yet. And it's not clear to me. In fact, I think it's pretty obvious that Israel will never be entirely self-sufficient in terms of arms. It's too small a country. It's never going to create that. It has an arms industry that, perfects Western weapons and produces some of its own, and, is in great demand from people who want arms around the world, which the United States isn't always that happy about. But Israel doesn't have the resources to compete with the United States, certainly, when it comes to, big ticket items like airplanes. There was a point in the 1980s when it was trying to produce its own jet fighter, the Kfir. The late Moshe Aarons, who is Israel's defense minister, that was his particular pet project. And he was very angry about it being, basically spiked by the first Bush administration and with some of its allies in Israel. But the logic was that this was something that was beyond Israel's ken. And, it could never do it on the scale that the United States could. Could Israel produce an F-35s in the numbers that it needed? I don't know, maybe, but it's not likely that that will ever happen. What it can do is provide, as it does, the United States with, upgrades to all of its own weapons and to help, joint projects with the United States on missile defense, which all of the great innovations in missile defense have been largely U.S.-Israel combined programs. But I think Israel has to be more self-sufficient, and I think it needs to move, and this has earned me some criticism when I've written this, I think it should move towards getting rid of the military aid budget from the United States. Now, other countries get lots of U.S. aid, and it doesn't go under under foreign aid. Europe's defense has been subsidized by the United States in the form of NATO allocations, that dwarf those of it, whatever Israel's gotten over the last, 60 years or so. Europe has gotten far more. It's called something different. And it's true that the aid to Israel is almost all spent in the United States. Is as much an aid program for U.S. Weapons manufacturers as it is for Israel. And yet it's a bad look. Israel is not a poor country anymore. It's not as rich as the United States, but it is a first world startup nation economy. It would be much better without that aid package. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is rightly, who rightly moved to get rid of economic aid in the 90s, which Israel certainly doesn't need anymore, and hasn't gotten for decades. I think the U.S. military aid package should, be on the extinction list as well. It would be better for Israel, help sell support for Israel better in the United States. But to get back to Gary Silo's question, would a more self-sufficient Israel have, necessarily worse relations with the United States? I would say no. Israel's close relations with the United States, its status as a strategic ally, doesn't date back to 1948. It dates back to 1967, Prior to the Six-Day War, which Israel won and then became vastly stronger, gave itself strategic depth, some of which is no longer in Israel's form of Sinai, but Israel's demonstration that it was a power in its own right is what made the United States more interested in making Israel an ally rather than an annoyance. Under the Truman, even though Truman recognized Israel, he did not allow any aid to Israel, even during its life and death struggle in 1948. The Eisenhower administration wasn't very friendly to Israel. Kennedy was the first president to sell some arms. It was basically some defensive weapons to Israel, but on a very small scale. And even in his first years as president, Lyndon Johnson didn't do so either. The real aid packages and the sense of treating Israel like an ally rather than a regional annoyance came after Israel showed that it could stand on its own 2 feet and defend itself. That's actually some of what J.D. Vance said when he made that pro-Israel speech that I mentioned earlier last year. The stronger that Israel is, the better ally Israel is to the United States. The more respected it will be. The stronger, the alliance will be. Weakness and the perception of weakness, especially even after October 7th and the idea that Israel was dependent on America to keep fighting the war against Hamas, that hurt the alliance. So the more, I believe, the more self-sufficient Israel is, the healthier the U.S.-Israel relationship will be. Next, viewer Paul Pesach Nissenbaum wrote in to ask, why hasn't anyone held Egypt responsible for the decades of allowing weapons and material through to Gaza? Well, that's a pretty fair question. Essentially, what he's asking is, what is Egypt? As far as Israel is concerned, it is a frenemy, sort of a friend and an enemy together, an ally, or is it a foe, or is it all some combination of all three? Well, I think it's obviously some combination of all three. Certainly the two governments, especially since General Sisi overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood more than a decade ago. He looks to Israel as a strategic friend, an ally in many ways against a becoming enemy of the Muslim Brotherhood and its offspring Hamas. But it's also a country that is overwhelmingly anti-Semitic, whose people are deeply hostile to Israel. We spoke under Mubarak, for decades after the peace treaty signed with Israel in 1979 of a cold peace with Egypt. Well, it's not really a heck of a lot warmer now, is it? It plays both ends against the middle. It often opposes Israel in international forums. And quite frankly, it is also as afraid of the Palestinians and of Hamas, maybe even more so than Israel. That's why it didn't let in any refugees from the war in Gaza. They've sealed off that border clearly, but they do allow commerce. They have always allowed commerce because Egypt is a very corrupt country, a military dictatorship, and a deeply corrupt one, and it wants to placate the anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, majority of its population. It's terrible, but I'd say it's clearly more of a frenemy and a tacit ally than a foe. Reader Nissenbaum also asked, what if Israel extends its sovereignty to Judea and Samaria? What will be the status of the 2 million Arabs who live there? Well, it's not clear to me that that's going to happen. And if it did, extending Israeli law, which is what annexation actually will be, would mean most probably just extending Israeli law to where the Jews live. Area C, where is basically under where all the Jews live. That would certainly enhance the rights of Jews there, who already live under Israeli law and vote in Israeli elections, but it would make it harder for Palestinians to sort of undermine the rights and of the Jews who live in those areas. But again, that's not a priority for Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's a priority for a lot of Israelis, certainly for the people who live in Judea and Samaria, which are hundreds of thousands, and many who sympathize with them. But that's an issue that quite frankly, the Trump administration doesn't want to have to deal with, because it embarrasses, sort of quote unquote moderate Arabs, the Arab regimes that everybody expects will sooner or later join in the Abraham Accords, including Saudi Arabia, something that I am on record as saying I don't believe will ever happen, which is sort of an episode by itself. But I think the status of the Arabs who live in Judea and Samaria will remain autonomy under the Palestinian Authority. I don't think that's likely to change. I think the likelihood of an all-out annexation, of incorporating all of Judea and Samaria, and not just the areas where the Jews live, into Israel proper, is something that is certainly some people advocate for it, and their position perhaps was strengthened by what happened in the Gaza war. But there's no consensus in favor of that in Israel. And it certainly would complicate relations with the Trump administration, and obviously even more so with any successors to Trump who are less friendly to Israel. So I'm a little skeptical that that's going to happen. Next, there were a lot of responses to our episode with former JNS editor Benjamin Kirstein, who has written a new book about self-defense. And most of them were about our discussion of the Jewish Defense League. In particular, one viewer with the handle of Louis Goldberg H4D wrote in to say that the late Rabbi Meir Kahane and the JDL were, contrary to what both Benji and I said, were not a failure. He says Jewish liberals and the liberal media made him into a pariah. He goes on to say the Soviet Jewry movement was going nowhere until Kahane and the JDL got involved in it, and he credits Glenn Richter of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry in saying so. Well, these are two distinct issues. You're absolutely right that Kahane and the JDL were early and strong supporters of the Soviet Jewry movement. The thing about the Soviet Jewry movement, all anybody seems to remember was the mass rally in Washington in 1987, where 250,000 Jews spoke out in favor, of Soviet Jewry. Well, 15 years earlier, there weren't any 250,000. Take it from me. There weren't any 250,000 Jews demonstrating for Soviet Jewry. That was a marginal issue. The Jewish establishment federations, a lot of the pro-Israel community as it was then, was very slow on the issue. It took sort of radicals and dissidents, the Porshim, as we'd say in Hebrew, who were the ones who spoke up. And Kahane was one of those who did. Not the only one, but he certainly was part of that. But to say that, he was only discredited by liberal Jews and the liberal media is a misnomer. He was right on Soviet Jewry, but he was wrong on violence and extremism and terrorism. The JDL was marginalized and was discredited by itself, and that same goes with Rabbi Kahane. Its embrace of violence against, what it viewed as Russian targets, where they bombed the office of impresario Sol Yurak, who was bringing over Soviet classical musical artists, and wound up killing his secretary, one of his secretaries, stuff like that. That's what killed the JDL, not its positions on Jewish defense, or even Kahane's positions on, about the Arabs and throwing all the Arabs out of Israel, though that was not a popular position in Israel any more than it was in the United States. A lot of people like to say he was right about everything. He wasn't right about everything. He would, in the end, sometimes style becomes substance about people, and I'm sure I'll get a lot of pushback about saying this. But Kahane's willingness basically to go to war against everybody who disagreed with him about every single issue, even marginally, ultimately isolated him and made it impossible for him to get any more than marginal support. And the JDL, by embracing terrorism, not being purely an activist group or even a Jewish self-defense group, but by engaging in violence, that was, that was just something that they could not survive and then should not have survived. Their idea, it was kind of rooted in this idea that Jews living in New York in the 60s and 70s, and, initially the JDL's efforts to defend elderly Jews and to create self-defense in Jewish communities, that was a good idea, But, too many of the kids who joined thought they'd read a little too much Leon Uris. They thought they were, in the Warsaw Ghetto. Well, New York in the 60s and 70s wasn't the Warsaw Ghetto. And acting as if it were led to some really bad stuff. And as Benji Kirstein rightly wrote in his book, it helped to discredit the idea of Jewish self-defense, which was terrible. And now, and especially now, when we need more concern about Jewish self-defense, and why it's so important that efforts in that direction not cross over into advocacy for terrorism and violence and concentrate on actually defending Jews in a reasonable and, effective way. And that's not ultimately what the JDL did. And while some well-meaning people joined it, and some of the ideas that Rabbi Kahana promoted in the course of doing that were not wrong. Ultimately, you're judged by your actions, and that's where we are with that. Now, there were a few questions about what podcasts I listen to and what has influenced me the most. Now, I will start with that by saying I recommend all the JNS podcasts. Go to wherever you get podcasts, go to the JNS channel. We have a lot of good ones. I'd like to especially recommend Israel Undiplomatic with Ruthie Bloom and Mark Regev. That's really a great way to stay apprised of what's going on in Israel and the important issues. And, you should never go a week without listening to what Ruthie says. And Mark too. Now, as to what I listen to, as part of my job, I stay apprised of what's being said and written in general on the issues that we report and write about at JNS. I skim lots of newspapers and journals every day. Especially when we started podcasts, I was making more of an effort to see what a lot of other people do in this genre. I wind up doing less of it now just because, I kind of living it, doing it myself. In terms of what podcast do I actually listen to myself, I do like, one recommendation, the Rest of History podcast with British historians Tom Holland and Dominic Sanborn. They're really informed and very funny about history and often have great reading recommendations. And my spare time, my academic training was in history. I read, not journalism, but history. I read a lot of history, and I'd recommend that you read the books that they cite more than just watching or listening to them talking about them. And I also say I sometimes disagree with them. Indeed, I actually name-checked Tom Holland and criticized him on a recent episode of Think Twice when we had the great historian Barry Strauss on, where I criticized the decision he had made in his writing. But that's a really good podcast that I like. As I said, with them, I tend not to watch many of them on the news so closely because this is what I'm doing. And to be honest, the podcasts that I will listen to probably most often are those on topics that are not related to my work, but reflect my interests outside of work, which is like sports. So I listen to a couple of podcasts about the teams I follow, namely the Yankees and the Islanders, and God help me, the Jets in football. I could actually use a good recommendation for an opera podcast because I love opera and classical music. Maybe in my next life, when I have more time, I might actually do one myself. As for influences, this was a question that was also asked last year when we did this show. I don't know that I answered it fully, but I was introduced to the world of ideas as really as a boy by watching William F. Buckley, the founder of the modern conservative movement on television and his famous firing line show, the original Talking Head show. Buckley had a profound influence on, my love of ideas, love of the world, love of music, because he was something that he promoted on his show as well, classical music and Bach. And I was also deeply influenced, especially once I got into college and started reading commentary by Norman Podhoretz, the late Norman Podhoretz, who we just lost a very short time ago. I eventually got to write for National Review for a few years, and I was an editor at Commentary for 8 years. But, Commentary, I think for me and for many other people in my generation and later generations as well, wasn't merely just the gold standard on thinking about the world, the Jewish world, secular ideas, books, and politics and foreign policy. It really helped shape our minds. And so, Norman, who was, a great man, a great thinker, really a seminal figure in modern American and Jewish history. We miss him, and he played a big role in forming my worldview. I should also give credit to my late mother of blessed memory, Jonathan Tobin, who was a prolific reader and schlepped me to the public library for new books to read every week. She was a brilliant student, never did, unfortunately, because of the time in which she grew up, she did not get the opportunity to pursue it further or go to college, but she inculcated in me a love of reading. The backdrop here in where I live is bookcases, but small part of my library, as my daughter likes to say. I live, in a library with some furniture thrown in. But also, my mother is in no small measure responsible for this crazy career of journalism, although it's not really what she intended for me. Because, and this is a story I don't know that I've ever shared publicly before, but when I was 6 or 7 years old, my favorite cartoon show was actually on at the same time. This is in the era where, we only had one television in the house, and there were only a few channels on television back in the Ice Ages. And I wanted to watch the cartoon show, but it was on at the same time as the nightly news. And after tolerating this for a short while, my mother said, "No, we're not going to watch cartoons anymore. We're going to watch the news," and sat me down. And we watched the news together, and I was hooked. And I, have been watching the news ever since. I've been a news junkie ever since, someone who cares about these ideas. And though, as I said, it's not exactly what she intended for me, as far as my professional life, that is what eventually led to my career as a journalist. Now, we could go on longer, but that's all the time we have. So I want to thank again everyone who sent in questions, whether you emailed them in or posted them on YouTube or on social media. And thanks to everyone in our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which you can hear wherever you get your podcasts. And whether you're listening to us on any one of them, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. I want to wish all of our readers, listeners, and viewers a very happy, healthy, and peaceful 2026. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself.